There are days when the weight of your own mind feels like too much to carry. Days when the noise inside your head is louder than anything happening around you. Days when you look completely fine on the outside and completely lost on the inside. And here is what nobody tells you. Humans have felt exactly this way for tens of thousands of years. The question is, what did they do about it before therapy existed? Before medication? Before anyone had a word for what they were going through? The answer is far stranger, far darker, and far more human than you might expect. Your brain is ancient. Not metaphorically, literally. The structure firing inside your skull right now evolved over millions of years, long before language, long before civilization, long before anyone had a name for the feeling of drowning inside your own thoughts. So when something went wrong with that brain, the people around you had to explain it somehow. They had to do something about it. And what they did tells you everything about how deeply human mental suffering really is. The oldest evidence of mental illness being recognized goes back roughly 10,000 years. Archaeological sites in Peru, in France, in ancient China have all uncovered the same haunting artifact: human skulls with holes drilled into them. Not accidental holes. Deliberate, carefully cut circular openings made with stone tools, sometimes multiple holes in the same skull. And here is the detail that stops researchers cold. Many of those skulls show bone regrowth around the edges of the holes. Which means the person survived. They lived through the procedure. They walked around afterward with a hole in their skull and kept on living. This practice is called trepanation, and it is the oldest surgical procedure ever documented in the human record. But why? Why would ancient people drill into someone's skull? Researchers like John Verano, a bioarchaeologist at Tulane University who has spent decades studying ancient Peruvian remains, believe trepanation was performed for a range of reasons. Head trauma, yes, but also seizures, hallucinations, violent behavioral changes, states that looked, to ancient eyes, like something had gotten inside the person's head and needed to come out. They were not entirely wrong, in their own way. When you cannot explain something, you reach for the most powerful explanation available to you. And for most of human history, the most powerful explanation available was the spirit world. Mental illness, across nearly every ancient culture, was understood as spiritual in nature. It was not a brain chemistry problem. It was not a trauma response. It was possession, punishment, a curse placed by an enemy, or a god, or a wandering spirit that had taken up residence somewhere it did not belong. This was not ignorance. This was the best explanatory framework humans had, built from everything they had observed about the world. And it shaped everything about how they responded. In ancient Mesopotamia, the region we now call Iraq, one of the oldest centers of civilization on Earth, Babylonian priests called Asclepius served as what we would today recognize as the first mental health professionals. They maintained detailed clay tablet records of what they observed. Tablets that described patients who could not sleep, who wept without reason, who heard voices, who could not feel joy. Tablets that are, in many ways, indistinguishable from a modern psychiatric intake form. The treatment, ritual, incantation, offerings to the gods. But alongside those rituals, the Asclepius also used plant-based medicines, combinations of herbs and roots that, in some cases, contained genuinely psychoactive compounds. Mandrake, henbane, compounds that altered the brain's chemistry in real, measurable ways. Whether they understood the mechanism or not, they were, in effect, medicating their patients. They were doing something. They were not turning away. In ancient Egypt, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving medical documents, dated to around 1600 BCE but believed to copy texts much older, contains clinical descriptions of brain injuries and their behavioral effects. Egyptian physicians understood, at least partially, that the brain governed behavior. That damage to the skull could change a person's personality, their speech, their ability to feel. They even described what sounds unmistakably like depression in their texts, referring to a heaviness of heart that no medicine of the body could touch. For that, they sent patients to temples. Temple sleep was a practice spread across the ancient Mediterranean world, in Egypt, in Greece, in Rome. A suffering person would travel to a sacred site, often a temple dedicated to a healing deity, bathe themselves, fast, and then sleep inside the temple's inner chamber, waiting for a dream. The dream was the diagnosis. The dream was the message from something larger than themselves, pointing at what was broken and what needed to change. You can laugh at that. But researchers studying the neuroscience of healing have noted something uncomfortable. The the reduction of stimulation, the community of other sufferers around you, the ritual cleansing, the focused intention, the act of sleeping in a safe and designated sacred space. These conditions actually do things to a stressed brain. They lower cortisol. They interrupt rumination. They create the neurological conditions for something like relief. Ancient people did not know that. But they were not doing nothing. What you start to notice, looking across cultures, is that ancient responses to mental illness almost always had three things in common: community, ritual, meaning. When a person in an indigenous culture in North America began showing signs of what we might now call a psychotic break, hearing voices, behaving erratically, becoming disconnected from those around them, the community's response was almost never isolation. It was the opposite. The person was brought into the center of communal life. Healers gathered. Ceremonies were performed, sometimes lasting days. The suffering person was not removed from the group. They were surrounded by the group. Anthropologist Richard Katz spent years living among the Kalahari Kungsan people of southern Africa and documented their healing practices in his work Boiling Energy. What he found was a community that regularly gathered for all-night trance dances, in which healers entered altered states of consciousness and used that state to work on the mental and physical suffering of others. The healer and the patient were bound together in a shared experience. Illness was a community event. Recovery was a community project. Compare that to what your world offers. In ancient Greece, around the 5th century BCE, the physician Hippocrates took the first systematic step toward a non-supernatural explanation for mental illness. He proposed that what we experience mentally is rooted in the physical body. In the four humours, the balance of fluids he believed govern health and temperament. Melancholia, the ancient Greek word for what we now call depression, literally meaning black bile, was, in his framework, a physical imbalance to be corrected through diet, rest, exercise, and changes in environment. He was not right about the mechanism. But the instinct was exactly right. The mind and the body are one system. What happens in the body changes the mind. What happens in the mind changes the body. This was a radical idea in 400 BCE, and we are still catching up to its full implications. The ancient Romans built on this. Asclepiades of Bithynia, a Greek-born physician working in Rome around 100 BCE, advocated for what would, by any modern standard, look like humane psychiatric care. He argued that the mentally ill should not be chained, should not be kept in darkness, should be given light, music, warm baths, social interaction. He believed that physical confinement made mental suffering worse, not better. He was largely ignored by subsequent centuries, which chose chains and darkness anyway. But he was right. And we know it now, 2,000 years later, from the research. What you begin to see across the ancient world is not a story of ignorance. It is something more complicated than that. There were people who genuinely tried to understand what was happening inside a suffering mind. There were people who built systems of care around those who could not care for themselves. There were communities that did not exile their most broken members, that brought them closer instead. And there were also, to be clear, practices that caused tremendous harm. The belief in possession led to exorcism practices that were violent and terrifying. There were people who were stoned, people who were abandoned, people whose suffering was interpreted as divine punishment and treated accordingly. The ancient world was not kind. But it was not only cruel, either. It was exactly as complicated as human beings always are. Here is what researcher Edward Shorter, a historian of psychiatry at the University of Toronto, argues in his work on the history of mental illness, that the core experience of mental suffering, the feeling of your mind working against you, the inability to feel pleasure, the hearing of voices, the unbearable weight of a darkness that has no external cause. These experiences appear consistently across every culture and every time period in the human record. The names change. The explanations change. The treatments change. But the suffering itself does not change. Your ancestors felt this too. They sat in the dark inside their own heads, in caves lit by firelight, and could not find a way out. They wept without knowing why. They heard things no one else heard. They felt cut off from the people around them by something invisible and inexplicable, and the people around them tried, however imperfectly, to reach them. That reaching, that refusal to leave the suffering person alone, may be the oldest human impulse there is. Today you have something ancient humans did not. You have the biology. You have the neuroscience. You have the clinical vocabulary to say what is happening and why. You have medications that target the specific systems that have gone wrong. You have therapists trained in approaches that actually work, not by drilling holes in the skull, not by summoning spirits, not by realigning humors, but by working directly with the patterns your brain has learned to run. And yet, even with all of that, you still need what ancient humans always needed: community, meaning, the experience of not being alone inside what you are going through. The science has changed. The medicine has changed. But the thing that makes the difference, the thing that has always made the difference, is whether another human being turns toward you instead of away. Tonight, if your mind feels like a place you cannot escape, remember this: you are standing at the end of an unbroken line of people who felt what you feel. People who looked for answers in the stars and in the earth and in the silence of a sacred room. People who were not broken. People who were human. And being human means your mind will sometimes be the hardest place to live. It has always meant that. You are not the first. And you will not face it alone.